The heel came down on the third layer first. A stiletto, deep burgundy leather with a red sole that cost more than the entire wedding cake, had cost me in flour and butter and 4 hours of sleep I never got. And Marguerite Fenwick drove it directly into the center of the cake I had baked with my own hands at 3 in the morning, watching the buttercream collapse around the point of impact, like something struck by a small, expensive meteor. What would you do if your new mother-in-law, at your own wedding reception, in front of 210 guests holding champagne flutes, shoved the dessert table hard enough to send it sliding across polished parquet, and then, once the cake had toppled and cracked open on the floor, stepped forward in her designer heels and ground the wreckage under her foot while laughing? What would you do if she said, loudly enough for the string quartet to stop playing, that she simply could not allow her son's wedding to be remembered for this poor girl's garage sale of a dessert, and the room, her room, full of her friends, laughed along with her? I did not scream. I did not cry. I stood beside the ruined dessert table in my simple lace gown, my hands folded in front of me, and I watched Marguerite Fenwick wipe frosting from the toe of her shoe onto the hem of the white tablecloth, and I said absolutely nothing, because I had learned, across a lifetime longer and stranger than anyone in that ballroom could imagine, that the person who says nothing in that moment is always the person who has already decided what happens next. They had no idea, not one soul among those 210 guests in silk and cashmere, that in exactly 9 minutes, the grand ballroom of the Sterling Continental Hotel would be surrounded by 32 black SUVs, bearing a crest that predated every fortune in that room by 6 centuries. They had no idea that the quiet bride they had spent 8 months treating as an embarrassment was the granddaughter of Emperor Aldrich Winfield Cross, sovereign ruler of the Winfield Imperium, and that 30 royal pastry chefs, flown in on an imperial jet that had been circling the airport for the last 40 minutes waiting for my signal, were about to march into that ballroom carrying a $5 million tower of edible gold that would make Marguerite Fenwick's ruined tablecloth the least of her problems by the end of the evening. Let me take you back to where this began, nearly 3 years earlier, to a woman named Hazel Byrne. Hazel Byrne worked as a records archivist at a regional historical society, spending her days cataloging donated collections of family letters, property deeds, and photographs that documented the ordinary lives of people whose names would never appear in any headline. She wore cardigans from department stores, carried a canvas satchel with a small tear at the strap she kept meaning to mend, and lived in a studio apartment above a bakery where the smell of fresh bread woke her most mornings before her alarm did. She was 29 years old, and by every visible measure, an unremarkable woman with a quiet, contained life, which was precisely the disguise I had constructed for myself, piece by careful piece, over nearly 3 years of deliberate anonymity. My real name is Seraphine Odile Winfield, and my grandfather is Emperor Aldrich Winfield Cross, sovereign ruler of the Winfield Imperium, a nation whose sovereign wealth fund held controlling interests in agricultural infrastructure, energy production, and 3 of the continent's oldest private banking institutions. I grew up inside palace walls surrounded by advisors and ministers and a rotating series of approved suitors, each one selected for the political or economic value he could offer the crown, each one looking at me at some point in our carefully arranged conversation with the particular flicker of a man performing silent arithmetic behind otherwise warm eyes. By the time I turned 26, I had asked my grandfather for time away. Time to discover whether an ordinary version of love existed for a woman whose face had been minted onto commemorative currency before her 10th birthday. He was reluctant, having loved my grandmother with a devotion that shaped the rest of his life, understanding better than anyone the particular loneliness of never being certain whether affection is genuine or calculated. He granted me leave on the condition of a discreet security detail, monitoring from a careful distance I would rarely be aware of. I became Hazel Byrne. I learned to love small, unremarkable pleasures, standing in line at a bakery without anyone rushing to intervene, eating a sandwich alone on a park bench without a single person calculating my net worth from across the grass. I met Theodore Fenwick at the Historical Society itself, where he had come to research his family's genealogy for a project he described, somewhat sheepishly, as a birthday gift for his grandmother. He was 32, worked as an architect at a mid-sized firm, comfortable but by no means wealthy in any way that would have drawn attention from my former world. He was patient and thorough in his questions, genuinely curious about the archival process rather than merely tolerant of it, and he made me laugh twice within our first 20 minutes of conversation. A genuine laugh I had not produced around a stranger in longer than I wanted to calculate. For nearly 2 years, Theodore was everything I had left the palace searching for. He remembered that I took my coffee with too much cream. He drove 2 hours one weekend simply to help me move into a slightly larger apartment when my lease ended. He proposed in the Historical Society's reading room after hours, surrounded by the very archives where we had met. With a ring he told me he had saved 6 months to afford. I said yes with my whole heart, believing, with the particular vulnerable hope of someone who has spent her life doubting the sincerity of everyone around her, that I had finally found something uncomplicated and real. Then Theodore's firm assigned him to a major commercial development project, and with that new visibility came his mother, Marguerite Fenwick, entering our engagement like a slow, deliberate infection. Marguerite was the kind of woman who had married comfortable wealth decades earlier and spent every subsequent year manufacturing the appearance of belonging to a far grander tier of society than she actually occupied. She wore Louboutin heels to grocery runs and carried a rotating collection of handbags she referenced constantly and unprompted in conversation. And she looked at my simple cardigan the first time she met me at a family dinner with an expression of polite, devastating disappointment she made no effort whatsoever to conceal. "Theodore tells me you organize old paperwork," she said, cutting her chicken with surgical precision. "How charming. Is there any real future in that sort of work, dear? Any advancement, financially speaking?" "It's meaningful work," I said. "I find it fulfilling." "Fulfillment is lovely," she said, smiling thinly, "when one can also afford real furniture." The cruelty accumulated steadily after that first dinner, always delivered with a practiced smile, always constructed so that objecting would make me appear oversensitive rather than her appear unkind. She introduced me to her friends as Theodore's little charity project, a phrase deployed with enough frequency that it eventually stopped registering as strange to anyone around us. She commented on my apartment above the bakery, my modest car, the fact that I had never once traveled outside the country, always circling the conversation back, eventually, to some implied deficiency in my prospects. At one family gathering, she handed me her coat at the door and asked me to hang it somewhere it won't get lost among the others, mistaking me, deliberately, I came to believe, for household staff rather than her son's fiancé. Then came Camille Ashworth, Theodore's college girlfriend, whose family owned a chain of luxury automotive dealerships across 3 states. She re-entered his professional orbit when her father's dealership group became a client of Theodore's architecture firm for a new flagship showroom, and suddenly she was present at every function that mattered. She attended his firm's holiday gala, seated beside him while I sat 2 tables back with junior associates and their spouses. She laughed at his jokes with her hand resting on his forearm, a beat longer than professional courtesy required. Marguerite adored her instantly and completely, discussing the showroom project with her in tones that made it sound like something far more personal than architecture. I confronted Theodore once, quietly, in the kitchen of the apartment we now shared. I asked him why his mother treated me like an intrusion, and why Camille Ashworth seemed to occupy more of his professional attention at every event than the actual project required. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I had come to recognize as the physical prelude to capitulation. "Hazel, please. The Ashworth dealership contract could make my career at the firm. My mother thinks staying close to that relationship matters. Can you just, for the next few months, not push back so hard? It's not personal. It's just business. And this could change everything for us financially. Just business." As though my repeated quiet humiliation across a dozen social occasions belonged to some separate category unrelated to the man who claimed to love me. I should have left that night. I did not. I told myself the wedding would resolve everything, that once we were married, Marguerite would finally accept me, and Camille would finally recede into the background, where she belonged. I was catastrophically wrong, though not in the way I expected. The wedding took place at a modest chapel that Theodore and I had chosen together, small and warm, and entirely ours, and it had gone, against all odds, beautifully. Marguerite had grumbled about the venue's size, but had not sabotaged the ceremony itself. It was the reception held afterward in the ballroom of the Sterling Continental Hotel, a room Marguerite had insisted on booking and decorating according to her own taste, that became the stage for what she had clearly been planning for weeks. 210 guests filled that ballroom, most drawn from Marguerite's social circle and Theodore's professional network, dressed in silk and cashmere, sipping champagne beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across the polished parquet floor. The air smelled of white lilies and expensive perfume, and the particular sweetness of the buttercream frosting on the cake I had made myself. 3 layers of vanilla sponge with a simple, rustic finish. Hand-piped flowers around the base. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would have looked out of place at any wedding held by any ordinary couple who loved each other and could not afford, or did not want, a $5,000 confection from a fashionable bakery. I had baked that cake at 3 in the morning the night before the wedding, in the small kitchen of our shared apartment, because I wanted something at our celebration that had been made entirely with my own hand, something that represented the version of love I actually believed in. Theodore had kissed my forehead when I finally climbed into bed at 5, exhausted, flour still under my fingernails, and told me it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Marguerite had seen it differently the moment it was wheeled into the ballroom. She had been standing near the dessert table when the cake arrived, dressed in deep burgundy silk with a matching clutch, and she had looked at the simple 3-tiered cake with an expression that started as confusion and resolved over the course of several seconds into something closer to genuine offense. "Is this a joke?" she said to the wedding coordinator standing nearby, loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "This is what we're serving my son's guests?" The coordinator, uncertain how to respond, said something about the cake being homemade, a personal touch from the bride. "A personal touch," Marguerite repeated and laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried across the ballroom and drew heads turning toward the dessert table. "This looks like something from a church bake sale." I stood near the edge of the room, watching this unfold, and I felt something in my chest go very still. The particular stillness that comes before a decision you have not yet consciously made, but have already, somewhere below language, arrived at. "Marguerite," I said, stepping toward her, keeping my voice level. "I made that myself. It means something to me." "Well, it certainly shows," she said, and several of the nearby guests laughed, the particular cruel laughter of people who have decided, collectively and instantly, that someone's humiliation is the evening's unexpected entertainment. Then she did something I had not anticipated, though perhaps I should have. She placed both hands against the edge of the dessert table and pushed. The table skidded across the polished parquet floor with a long, ugly scraping sound, and the cake slid with it, tilting and then toppling entirely onto the floor in a collapse of vanilla sponge and buttercream. The careful hand-piped flowers I had spent an hour perfecting smearing across the wood in pale streaks. The ballroom went silent, the particular silence that feels louder than any noise. the silence of 210 people simultaneously understanding they are witnessing something they will discuss at dinner parties for years. Marguerite stepped forward, and in her burgundy heels, the same shade as her dress, calculated down to the accessory, she stepped directly into the wreckage of the cake, grinding her heel into the largest remaining piece, twisting it slightly, the way one might extinguish a cigarette. "There," she said, straightening, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve. "I simply could not allow my son's wedding to be remembered for this poor girl's garage sale of a dessert. Some standards must be maintained, even when the bride herself doesn't understand them." Laughter rippled through pockets of the crowd, cruel and immediate, several guests actually applauding, a slow, mocking rhythm that others joined without hesitation. Someone near the back said, not quietly enough, "Honestly, what did she expect, marrying into this family with a cake like that?" I looked at the wreckage on the floor. I looked at Marguerite's satisfied expression, at the frosting smeared across the sole of her designer shoe, at Theodore standing several feet away with an expression of pained, useless discomfort, saying nothing, doing nothing, the same passive silence he had offered every single time his mother had humiliated me over the past 8 months. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I felt the heat of humiliation trying to climb up through my chest, and I refused it entry, the way I had been trained since childhood to refuse it entry, the way my grandfather had refused it entry through decades of diplomatic insults delivered by men who believed themselves untouchable. "You should not have done that," I said quietly to Marguerite, my voice carrying anyway through the stunned ballroom. She laughed again, delighted by what she perceived as my helpless defiance. "Or what exactly, dear? What could you possibly do about it?" I did not answer her with words. I reached into the small clutch I had carried all evening, the one Marguerite had once described, months earlier, as sweet, in a thrift store sort of way, and withdrew a phone, black and unmarked, connected to exactly one number I had prayed for nearly 3 years I would never need to dial at my own wedding. I dialed. It rang once. "Grandfather," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "It's time. Please send them in." Confusion moved across Marguerite's face. She glanced at Theodore, who shrugged, equally lost, both apparently unable to grasp that the woman he had spent 2 years calling Hazel had just placed a call that would end their family's entire way of life within the hour. For the first several minutes after that call, nothing appeared to change. Marguerite resumed holding court near the ruined dessert table, recounting the incident to a small cluster of her friends with visible relish, framing herself as a defender of standards rather than the architect of a public humiliation. Then the sound began to reach the ballroom from outside, distant at first, a low mechanical hum building steadily beneath the murmuring crowd, the unmistakable rhythm of many engines approaching in disciplined formation along the hotel's circular drive. A few guests near the tall windows turned their heads toward the sound, frowning, uncertain what they were hearing over the string quartet, which had resumed a nervous, uneven rendition of something classical. The hum grew louder, resolving into the specific low register of heavy vehicles moving in convoy, converging on the sterling Continental Hotel with a precision that no ordinary traffic pattern could explain. Through the windows nearest the entrance, guests could see headlights sweeping across the hotel's grand facade, dozens of them, arranged in disciplined, unbroken formation. At the 8-minute mark, the grand doors of the ballroom, tall and gilded, designed for elegant entrances rather than dramatic interruptions, were pushed open from outside, and the room filled with the sight of 30 men and women in white chef's uniform, each one wearing a small gold pin at the collar bearing the Winfield imperial crest, flanked on either side by armed guards in formal dress uniform, navy and gold, moving with the fluid, practiced discipline of people who had done this before and understood exactly the weight of what they were carrying. Between them, wheeled in on a reinforced cart built specifically for the purpose, was a cake, unlike anything that ballroom or that city had ever seen assembled in a private event. 7 tiers, each one wrapped in hand-applied edible gold leaf that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in warm, shifting patterns across the ceiling. Sugar-spun flowers in impossible detail cascaded down one side, each petal individually shaped and dusted with something that shimmered faintly, catching light like frost. The base tier alone was wider than the ruined dessert table Marguerite had shoved to the floor. The whole structure rose nearly 6 feet, crowned with a small, precisely rendered sugar sculpture of the Winfield imperial crest. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Marguerite's satisfied expression crumbled into visible confusion. Theodore's face had drained to the color of the tablecloth still stained with frosting at his feet. Through the center of the procession, walking at the measured, entirely unhurried pace of a man who had spent 7 decades moving through rooms that arranged themselves around him, came Emperor Aldrich Winfield Cross. He was 79 years old, silver-haired, dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in a charcoal suit of impeccable, understated tailoring that nonetheless commanded more authority than any crown could have added to it. He walked past 210 frozen guests and stopped directly in front of me. He looked at my face, at the ruined cake still visible on the floor behind me, at Marguerite's stunned expression, and something in his stern, weathered bearing softened, just barely, just for me. "Granddaughter," he said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, the particular weight of a man who had addressed parliaments and never once needed to raise his voice to command a room. "I understand your cake was not treated with the respect it deserved. I have taken the liberty of correcting the oversight." The word landed across the ballroom like a dropped chandelier. Granddaughter. Guests who had been laughing minutes earlier now stared with open mouths, the calculations happening visibly behind their eyes. Marguerite's voice came out strangled. "Granddaughter of what, exactly?" The Emperor turned to her slowly, the deliberate motion of a man acknowledging someone he has already decided precisely how to handle. "Emperor Aldrich Winfield Cross," he said, "sovereign ruler of the Winfield Imperium. The woman whose wedding cake you just destroyed with your own foot in front of 210 witnesses is Her Imperial Highness Seraphine Odile Winfield, heir apparent to a treasury that could purchase this hotel, this street, and several others like it without noticing the expenditure." Theodore made a sound between a laugh and a gasp, the particular noise of a man watching his entire understanding of reality dissolve in real time. "That's not possible. Hazel works at a historical society. She lives above a bakery. She takes the bus. She was hiding from people exactly like your mother," the Emperor said, his voice cold enough to frost the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. "People who measure worth by the price of a dessert and destroy what they don't understand, rather than simply asking. You have all just confirmed publicly, in front of witnesses and cameras, precisely why she was right to hide." One of the guards stepped forward and addressed Marguerite directly. "Mrs. Fenwick, I am required to inform you that the destruction of property belonging to a member of the Winfield imperial family, performed publicly and with clear intent, constitutes a formal offense under treaty provisions between the Winfield Imperium and this nation, provisions your government has already been notified of this evening. As part of the resolution process, you will personally clean the floor you damaged, under supervision, before this reception concludes." Marguerite's face went a shade of white that made her lipstick look garish by contrast. "You cannot possibly expect me to—" "I expect you to comply," the guard said, "or to explain your refusal to the diplomatic authorities currently en route to this hotel." A second official, a woman in a dark suit carrying a tablet, approached Marguerite next. "Mrs. Fenwick, your primary credit accounts, held through 2 banking institutions with correspondent relationships to Winfield-affiliated financial services, have been flagged for review as of 6 minutes ago, following formal notice of tonight's incident. Your cards will not process further transactions until that review concludes. I would estimate that process taking no less than several months." Marguerite reached into her clutch, withdrew her phone, and stared at a screen full of declined transaction notifications with an expression of dawning, genuine horror. I finally stepped forward, my simple lace gown trailing over the parquet floor, past the wreckage of the cake I had made with my own hands, and looked at the woman who had spent 8 months treating me as beneath consideration. "You called my cake garbage," I said, "in front of everyone who matters to you. I want you to look at what real wealth actually looks like, Marguerite, so you finally understand the difference between having money and having taste, because you have spent 8 months confusing the two." Marguerite said nothing. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she had nothing to say at all. Theodore stepped toward me, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Seraphine, please." I should have said something. Every single time. I should have stopped her. I was a coward. "Please." "You were," I said. "For 8 months, I watched you choose your mother's comfort over my dignity every single time. And tonight, you watched her destroy something I made with my own hands at 3 in the morning, and you said nothing. Do not ask me for forgiveness at the exact moment the consequences are. Ask yourself why you needed consequences to arrive before you found your voice at all." I turned to my grandfather, who watched this entire scene with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited nearly 3 years to defend his granddaughter's dignity exactly as it deserved. "I'm ready to go home, grandfather," I said. He offered his arm. I took it. Behind us, 30 royal chefs began the careful, ceremonial process of presenting the gold cake to 210 guests who ate it in near total silence, while, on the floor beside the ruined remains of the cake I had actually made, Marguerite Fenwick knelt in her burgundy silk gown, a cloth in her hand, scrubbing buttercream from the parquet under the watchful eyes of 2 guards, her Louboutin heels discarded beside her, because kneeling in them had proven impossible. We walked out through the ballroom's gilded doors into the cool evening air, past the line of tactical guards standing at perfect attention, toward the convoy of 32 matte black armored vehicles gleaming beneath the hotel's exterior lights, their engines already running, doors opening in perfect synchronized precision as we approached. News cameras, alerted by someone in my grandfather's communications office who had clearly anticipated this outcome, captured every second of it, footage that would circulate across society and financial networks for days, an object lesson in what happens when cruelty mistakes silence for weakness and arrogance mistakes appearance for actual worth. I did not look back. I did not need to. I already knew exactly what I would see: a woman on her knees on a ballroom floor, and a husband who had finally, far too late, found the courage to speak. Inside the lead vehicle, my grandfather sat across from me as the convoy pulled away from the Sterling Continental Hotel, leaving chaos and quiet devastation behind us in equal measure. "Are you all right, Seraphine?" he asked, using my true name with the particular gentleness he reserved only for me. "I am better than all right," I said, watching the hotel shrink in the rear window. "I finally understand something I should have recognized months ago. A cake made with love was never the problem in that room. The problem was a family that could not recognize love when it was standing right in front of them, offering itself freely without a price tag attached. True power, I have learned across a lifetime spent watching my grandfather govern a nation without ever once raising his voice, does not need to shout to prove its worth, does not need to compete with a woman's cruelty over a dessert table. True power sits quietly in a cardigan, cataloging old letters in a small historical society, baking a simple cake at 3 in the morning, because the making of it matters more than its cost, and when it is finally provoked into revealing itself, it does not argue or plead for recognition. It simply makes one phone call and watches 30 chefs walk in carrying gold, while the woman who destroyed something made with love scrubs a floor on her knees in the dress she wore to humiliate someone she never understood. Marguerite Fenwick spent the following months navigating frozen accounts, diplomatic inquiries, and a social circle that had watched, in real time, the complete unraveling of everything she had spent decades pretending to be. Theodore Fenwick, whose silence had cost him more than he understood in the moment, spent the rest of that year discovering exactly how much a marriage weighs when one partner has spent 8 months failing to defend the other. And I walked away with exactly what I had arrived with: my true name, my composure, and the absolute certainty that I would never again allow anyone to mistake the simplicity of something I made with my own hands for a lack of worth. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did Marguerite get exactly what she deserved for destroying a bride's handmade cake in front of 200 guests? If you loved watching arrogant elites lose everything the moment they discovered exactly who they had been humiliating, smash that like button. Share this story with everyone you know who believes in real justice, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of karma, quiet power, and the devastating cost of underestimating the woman standing quietly at your own reception.